Hello, everybody. Welcome to BeerSmith podcast number 76. Got a great show for you today. We're going to talk on Schwarzbier, which I think you'll enjoy. Just a couple iTunes announcements today. First of all, I've got all 76 episodes of BeerSmith now available on the iTunes store. I actually reworked the feed, and there's a new feed address, which you can find in the show notes for this episode if you're using something besides iTunes to subscribe. But now you can download all 76 episodes of iTunes if you go to the iTunes store. Second announcement is I've added a video channel on iTunes as well, and starting with episode number 75, we've got episode number 75 as well as the current episode number 76 on there, so you can subscribe there as well. Go to iTunes, look for BeerSmith, and look for our new video channel and download the video episodes. I'll be adding some of the older episodes as I have time to remaster some of those and put them in the proper format, get them on the server and so on. But we'll have those starting with episode number 75. And finally, of course, you can always catch all of the podcasts streaming live 24/7 at BeerSmith Radio at beersmith.com/radio. Again, that's beersmith.com/radio, and that's streaming 24/7 to your mobile device, computer, whatever you happen to listen to. And now, without further ado, let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is Jason Jaworowicz. He is president of the Grandville, Michigan-based homebrew club, Rivertown Homebrewers. Jason is a process engineer with Stryker in Portage, Michigan. He's been brewing since 2009. He currently works on a blog article, Resurrecting the Style Grodzitsky, based on Stan's podcast, which we did just a couple episodes ago. Jason, it is fantastic to have you up on the show.
Hey, Brad, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
How are you doing up there in Grand Rapids?
You know, we're starting to get a thaw finally. Just like you, we've gotten a lot of snow, but the weather's turning around, and we're hoping to get rid of some of the snow that's piled up. But a little bit worried about the water that's going to come with it, so we're just going to kind of take it as it comes. Yeah.
Well, we're doing this. This episode's the end of February, roughly, and we're going to talk a little bit about Schwarzbier today, which is a great style, a great German style. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about Schwarzbier and the origin of Schwarzbier.
Yeah, sure. So Schwarzbier, literally translated from the German, means black beer, and that does a good job to describe it because it's going to be a very dark, malty German lager. It's got its origins in the southeastern German states of Thuringia and Kulmbach. And it's a lot of times it's going to be referred to as a dark or a black Pils, but really as a style, it's got a lot more in common with Bavarian Dunkel because it's not as dry and hoppy as the Pilsner, and it's got a more malt character.
Can you talk a little bit about the history of it? I know it's one of the older beers in Europe.
Well, yeah, it's got a rich history, but really to kind of talk about that history, it makes sense to me to start with the present. So there's really two top-selling commercial versions of this beer made in Germany today, and they are, pardon me if the pronunciation is not right, but there's the Kostritzer Schwarzbier, which is made in the Bad Kostritz state of Thuringia. That brewery was founded in 1543, and it is currently today the best-selling German dark lager on the market. The second most popular commercial style is the Klostermannschaft Schwarzbier, which is made in neighboring Kulmbach. Kulmbach is perhaps the oldest active brewing center in Europe. There's evidence dating back to the 1300s that a cluster of monks had a complete brew house on the premises in Kulmbach, hence the name Kloster. Another interesting fact about it is that Schwarzbier is the beer which we have the oldest documented history for a European-style lager. There was an archaeological dig near Kulmbach in 1935, which uncovered an ancient crock dating back to about 800 BC. And they were able to identify actual blackened barley bread in that crock, which would have been a common ingredient of Germanic brews at the time. So clearly that would have been an ale, but it's not a stretch to think that blackened ale made from that barley bread turned into the lager that we enjoy today.
So a lot of people aren't familiar with that beers were made from bread back in ancient times. How was that done?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of history on it, but it seems to me like they would have taken the bread, which would have had yeast and barley present, so the sugar was there, and they probably would have just put it into fermenting vessels with water, and nature took its course. Sometime later, you've got something that tastes really good and makes you feel really good.
That's pretty awesome. Can you provide us with a picture of the style? What does the beer taste like, and what does it look like?
Yeah, sure. So, looking at the BJCP guidelines for this style, it's category 4C. It's part of the dark lagers. And it has the vital statistics of an OG of 1046 to 1052, finishing gravity of 1010 to 1016, IBUs 22 to 32, and then an SRM of 17 to 30. So if you think about what that means, your appearance is going to be a dark brown to black. These beers typically have red, amber, or ruby highlights. They're going to have a thick tan head, which has a good stand to it and is persistent throughout the beer. Aromatics are going to be mild to moderately malty. Caramel, roasty notes, coffee, chocolate. It's appropriate to have noble hop aroma in the finish. Very neutral yeast character. It shouldn't have diacetyl or fruity esters. And then, as most lagers, it's light sulfur notes are acceptable, but it doesn't want to be a lot. The flavor and mouthfeel is going to be medium to medium high bodied. It's got fairly decent carbonation, which helps present a more dry beer with the amount of malt that you're putting into this. It's going to dry it out a little bit. It's not going to be as sweet as a Dunkel. There shouldn't be any harshness or astringency in the beer, so that makes your malt selection for the roast character fairly important. And it needs to have a focus on malt, but not sweetness. So we're looking for that malt character, but we're not looking for residual sweetness, even though it is somewhat under attenuated. And then the hops are at an appropriate level to balance out the maltiness, to just keep it a well-balanced beer, a little bit on the malty side, but not too sweet.
Very cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about brewing a Schwarzbier. Let's start with the grain bill. How about that? Okay.
Well, I just brewed one about 5 weeks ago, and so right now it's in the lagering stage. But so basically, it's a German lager. It's a classic German lager, and so if you're going to brew a German lager, you need to use German grains. So I typically start. I'm planning my grain bill around 100% authentic German malts. I start with a range of about 70 to 90% Pilsner malt. That gives it a good firm malt backbone. I'm a big fan of the Weyermann products, and I think for this one I used the Bohemian Pilsner, but in lagers in the past I've used their floor malted, which gives you a little bit fuller body, but so I'd use that on a Pilsner. But with this one I did the Bohemian. Then you're going to go 5 to 25% German Munich malt. Some color contribution, but it's going to give you that malty sweetness more so than the color. So if you want a little bit sweeter beer, a little bit more malt character, you're going to go heavier on the Munich and a little bit closer to 70% on the Pilsner. If you want a little bit less malt character, you're going to go heavier on the Pilsner and lighter on the Munich.
So what was the percentage on the Munich again?
I had about 5 to 25%. And I did some research on this, and I found varying numbers. Some no more than 10 to 15% Munich, and some said 30 to 50. I saw some that said as much as half. When I was formulating the recipe, it seemed like too much Munich was going to make it more like an Oktoberfest, and I didn't want that. So I really wanted to have the color contribution, a little bit of that malt sweetness, but with a lot of Pilsner backbone, just to have that clean malt character. Now the color and the roast character that's going to be in this beer is going to come primarily from the next edition, which is going to be the 4 to 6% of the Weyermann Carafa 2 or Carafa 3 specialty malts. And I believe these are a dehusked roast malt. So they get rid of that husk, and you don't have the astringency that comes with it, and the tannins that'll come with that. But you do get the color, you get the roast character, and but it's just fairly inert. So you're not making a porter or a stout style beer where you've got a lot of that harsh astringency. And then, as the last part of the grain bill, something I kind of came up with on my own. I like to do a 1 to 2% melanoidin or aromatic. And although the style guidelines don't really talk about this being a traditionally decoction mash brewed beer, I have to imagine that it came from Germany, and it's one of the oldest German beers that we've got. So I'm pretty sure that it had to be decoction mashed at one time. So I'll put 1 to 2% melanoidin in there, and that's going to give me it's going to give me some characters of the Maillard reactions that are going to occur during that decoction process, without going to the process itself and spending the 6 to 8 hours on a brew day.
Yeah, I like to use melanoidin malt as well. I think it's a good substitution for for having to do that painful 5-hour decoction or something like that.
Oh yeah, it's not fun. Everybody's got to do it once. I think you've said on your podcast before, and you're right. Everybody's got to do it once. I think I went ahead and did it 3 times, but man, that's a long day.
Yeah, you got to learn the hard way. You can't just you can't just take somebody else's word for it, right?
Yeah, that's right. You go out of your way to find under-modified malts so that you can do a decoction.
Well, that brings me to my next question, which is simply, what kind of mash profile do you like to use for this beer?
Well, nowadays you've all got very well modified malts, so I don't feel the need to do a multi-step infusion. There's no need for an acid rest. There's no need for a protein rest. So I typically am going to do a single step infusion at about 152, and I'm going to do that for 60 to 70 minutes. Or the point would be until completion. I don't do an iodine test. I know some do. So I typically go 60 to 70 minutes. I'm doing 152 because, again, I want to target balance. I don't want to be at 154 to 155 and get a super unattenuated beer that's got a lot of sweetness left in it, and I don't want to be down at 149 and dry it out completely down to a 1006 and just have nothing left. So 152 is a good balance. Mm-hmm. I'm going to do that for 60 to 70, as I said, and then I'm going to mash in with a mash out at 168. I typically will hold that for about 10 minutes, and then the whole purpose there is just to thin the mash out, give me a little bit easier runoff, and then to facilitate the Vorloff, set the bed. And then I'll do a sparge, a fly sparge, batch sparge, either one. I've done both on lagers. I typically do a fly sparge on my system just because I'm set up for it, but I'm going to do that for anywhere between 30 or 40 minutes, or until I reach the necessary volume. And that's going to get me the wort and the kettle that I need to start my boil. A point worth making is that I have fairly alkaline water here in Granville. It's not terrible, but it's 115 ppm as calcium carbonate. So this is a dark beer. I'm probably not going to be in too much trouble, but it's not that dark, and I don't have a lot of caramel grains, and I don't have a lot of roast grains. So mostly base malts, I'm going to be up, at 5.6 to 5.7 pH. So I do treat my water with 2 grams of calcium chloride per 5 gallons of mash to bring that pH down to the 5.2.
Just as a buffer, huh?
Yeah, just as a buffer to try and get rid of some of that residual alkalinity that's going to remain. Give it some calcium to buffer that, and then the chloride is there to round out that malt character. If I wanted to brew a hoppy beer, I'd be putting some gypsum in there and going for the sulfate. But in this case, I want that malt character again to come through. So. And then I always acidify my sparge water. I think Gordon Strong talked about it on a previous podcast, and it just made a ton of sense that why would you fight the temperature and fight the pH of the runoff and then have to stop before you got the necessary volume of liquor if you can just pre-acidify your water. So in Granville, for anybody that's from this area, I use 7 milliliters of 25% phosphoric per 5 gallons of sparge water, and that gets me down to a pH of 5.5 throughout the entire runoff. and that just limits tannin extraction and keeps me in that safe zone.
Very cool. I was wondering if you could talk about hops now and what the hop to grain ratio, hop to grain balance is in this particular beer.
Yeah, sure. Well, this is, you talk about the BU to GU ratio that John Palmer talks about in How to Brew, and the ratio in this one is about a half to 0.75 to 1. So your bitterness is going to be just slightly less than your gravity units. And if you think back to the style guidelines that we talked about earlier, you've got an upper OG of 1052, and you've got an upper bitterness of 32. So you're looking at just about half, maybe a little bit over. So the hops are there only to balance out the maltiness, so you don't have too sweet of a beer, but you don't want it to be a hoppy, bitter IPA. This is not a German black IPA. So that's where your ratio is going to be. Now the type of hops or the variety, really you're looking, again, it's a German beer. It's a German lager, so you're looking at German noble hops across the board. I go with Hallertau just about 99% of the time, except for on Czech Saaz or on the recent Grodzisky I did. I'm going to use a Lublin on the Grodzisky, and I'm going to use Saaz if I'm doing a Pilsner. But so I did Hallertau for all additions on this beer, and I want to try and go to cone hops if I can. And I was lucky enough in this particular case to get them. If you can't get the Hallertau, then you just want to stay with a German noble. So you're going to go to a Saaz. You're going to go to the Polish version of the Saaz, to a Lublin if you can get it, a Tettnanger, a Spalter, whatever other European noble hop you can get.
So just about any of the noble varieties will work out well, I would imagine.
Pretty much. And you're just going to, the primary portion of this is going to be in the bitterness. You do want, if you look at the style guidelines, they do talk about there being some noble hop aroma. So, Saaz are a little bit spicy, a little bit peppery. So you might want to use those for your bittering and try a little bit more inert hop so that you get a little bit more of that character. But I think any noble hop's going to do it. And then the additions, typically I'll do a first wort hop. And I know you've talked about that before too. It does just give you a smoother bitterness. It does good to balance, but it's not harsh. It doesn't have a bite. It's nice and clean. And then I'll do a 15 to 20 minute addition to give it a little bit of flavor, a little bit of that character. And then I typically will do a knockout steeping addition, or if you have a whirlpool capability, you could do a whirlpool hop.
Mm-hmm. What about fermentation? Once you get into fermentation with this beer, is there anything? Well, first of all, let's talk about yeast, I guess. What yeast varieties do you prefer?
Well, there's your two main liquid yeast manufacturers. You got Yeast and you got White Labs, and both of them make a couple of strains that are really good for the style. For the one that I did, I used the Yeast Bohemian Lager, number 2124. Mm-hmm. But a good backup to that would be their Bavarian 2206. And then from White Labs, you've got their Southern German lager, which is their WLP 838. That's going to give you a nice, clean, neutral finish. And then their German lager, WLP 830, is also an option. And then another thing that I think a lot of advanced homebrewers don't think about, and sometimes if you're just you're trying to get a brew in, maybe it's a good idea to try, is the Fermentis dry lager yeast. They make a nice, clean, neutral German lager yeast. They're Saflager S189, and I've used their Saflager S23 before, and got a gold medal on a lager I made with it. So, just because it's a dry yeast doesn't mean it won't make a fantastic beer.
Yeah, I think you can make great beer with dry yeast. Obviously, especially a lot of the modern strains. They've come a long way, in the past few years.
Yeah, Fermentis does a great job. They make some great ale yeast. They make some great lager yeast. They pretty much cover the range, and they keep on coming out with more. So it really does open up the options if you don't want to spend the time to prepare a starter a week in advance and then double pitch to that starter to grow your cell count, or buy 2 or 3 smack packs at $9-10 a piece. So it's a great option. Plus you can keep them on hand.
Yeah, they're quick,
nice.
And as you point out, you don't necessarily need a starter with when you're brewing with dry yeast. You can just hydrate it, and if you need 2 packets, use 2 packets, which probably you do need, this is an important point, I guess, when you're brewing a lager, you do need more yeast, don't you? You talk about that for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. That was the next point on the list here, is that when you're brewing a lager, you need a cell count 2 to 3 times that of what you do with an ale, and you really don't want to underpitch. Underpitch is going to cause the yeast to become stressed. They're not going to have the nutrients that they need for the entire colony at each stage, and so they're going to produce a lot of off flavors. They're going to tire out. They're not going to clean up the byproducts that they make early in the fermentation at the end. So I'm a big fan of there's this software called BeerSmith, and they've got a starter calculator.
I've never heard of it.
There. Never heard of it. So I'll do that. I know a lot of people, some of the people in our club are really fond of the Mr. Malty site by Jamil, and that does a good job too. So it's just important to know what you're going to need, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to go into this making a lager and then that the brew day comes up and you don't realize that you don't have enough yeast. You're not going to do yourself any favors. It's not going to be the lager you want it to be.
No, exactly. Yeast is critically important, especially when you're brewing a lager. I mean, it just makes such a huge difference.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. There's nowhere to hide. Lagers are just so clean and so so full of mild character that there's nowhere to hide that off flavor. It's just going to be right out in front.
Yeah, they really bring out the flaws. If you make a mistake in a lager, you usually know it pretty quickly.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
Well, that kind of brings me to my next question, which is fermentation. And a lot of people don't have good fermentation temperature control. How do you recommend fermenting this particular beer?
Well, it's interesting that my very first year brewing, I went from a Northern Brown English Ale extract kit to an IPA extract kit to I'm doing a Bock. Right, so third beer in, and I decided that I'm going to do a German lager, and but I'm lucky in that I live in Michigan, so 5 months out of the year I've got weather that I can lager in. Sometimes the challenge is keeping it from getting too cold. So what I've always done is I've always brewed lagers in the winter. I take advantage of that natural refrigeration. And then I'll wrap the carboy in some memory foam, and I'll put a heating pad around it, or a brew belt, or a brew pad, or a brew plate, or whatever it takes. And I typically monitor it every morning, plug the thing in, unplug it, hook up a Christmas tree light timer, whatever it takes. But there's ways to work around that. Now, right now, I've got a room in my basement that I can keep at about 55 degrees when I'm fermenting, and I can just crack the window and leave it at 33 degrees the rest of the time when I'm lagering. But if you have the ability and you don't have cold weather, a chest freezer, you can pick one up usually on eBay or Craigslist. Doesn't cost that much. You put a $50 temperature control on it, and you can lager year round, which is really nice. But so to talk about the temperature requirements of a lager and why you need that refrigeration, we can talk a little bit about the temperature for fermentation and why that's important.
No, that'd be great. Why don't we talk about where these yeasts need to be?
Yeah. So they all have their range, but a typical I'd say that your average lager strain is going to want to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 48 to 58 degrees for your primary fermentation phase, which is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 10 days. I typically start them right around there, so I'm not gonna chill them way down to 40 degrees and let them rise, and I'm not gonna start them at 70 and cool them down. To get the yeast started, I typically start them at 50 to 55. I'll let them ride out at 50 to 55 for 7 to 10 days. When they get to the point where I feel like the airlock activity is slowing down, I'll pop the lid, take a peek, and see if the Croissant's subsiding. If it is, I'll take a sample and check my gravity. If I find that I'm at terminal gravity, so for this beer, that's going to be a 1012 to a 1016, I'm going to pull off a little sample and I'm gonna taste it. I'm going to see if I detect any diacetyl, buttery notes, butterscotch notes. If I don't, great. It's time to cool it down to 33 degrees and start the lagering phase. But if I do, that's where the diacetyl rest comes in.
Yep.
And that's just yeast produce diacetyl during the normal fermentation process. So it's something that's going to be in the beer. What's important is, were the yeast healthy? Did they have enough nutrients, micronutrients, and to throughout the process to be able to finish up at the end, clean up those byproducts before they started going dormant. So if I detect that diacetyl, I'm just going to move the beer out to a room that's a little bit higher temperature, room temperature, 65 degrees or whatever, which, it's a little bit higher than some would suggest, but it's easy to manage. I don't have to put an extra heater on it. I don't have to put an extra cooler on the room or change the temperature. I just bring it out and let it go for a couple days.
Yeah, traditionally you only go a few degrees up, right? Isn't that true?
Right, yeah, that's typically, but, that's hard to manage. So I found that I get excellent results if I do have diacetyl. Now, at 55 degrees, I typically don't have diacetyl at 7 to 10 days. I can typically go straight to 33 degrees, let everything start to settle, and then rack it off in a couple of days. But if I do need it, I find that going up to 65 for a day or two doesn't hurt. And usually within a couple hours, I'm going to see the airlock activity pick up. That yeast comes back to life, revigorates, and goes through and cleans up the mess that it made. And then typically after a day or two, I'm going to have no diacetyl detected left in the beer.
Fantastic. So Jason, this is a lager, and typically with a lager, you're gonna age it a little bit longer than you might with your typical ale. I was wondering if you could talk about aging the lager out.
Yeah, sure. With an ale, you're gonna ferment, 5 to 7 days until you reach terminal gravity, and then you're gonna either rack that into a secondary if it needs to settle and clear out a little bit more, or if you're not too concerned about the clarity of the beer, or if it's pretty clear already, you're just gonna rack it into a bottling bucket or a keg, and you're gonna carbonate. But with a lager, you want to give it some cold aging time, and what that's going to do is allow those flavors in the beer to mellow. Allow some of those esters, if they were produced by the yeast, to kind of fall into the background. Allow that diacetyl again to continue to fall a little bit lower and lower down the perception scale. As the yeast do continue to work a little bit at that colder temperature, they're not going to do quite as much, but they're still going to work. As typically, this lasts from about 30 to 45 days. Some people will go as long as 60. In the case of the Oktoberfest, they went 8 months. So, they were willing to wait that long. But I find that typically 30 to 40 days is about all I need. Now that presents another problem when it comes to bottle conditioning, and that's that you've now had a beer that has been cold crashed for 30 to 45 days, and chances are there's not a lot of yeast still floating around in there. So if you just go ahead and rack that with some priming sugar into a bottling bucket like you're going to do with an ale, you might find yourself having a lot of flat beers.
Yeah.
The first barley wine that I did, I had this problem because it sat for 6 months and there was just no yeast left to eat the sugar.
Really?
So I had to actually take the caps off and spike those beers to get some carbonation. Oh yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah. So before I did my first lager, bottle conditioned my first true lager, I did some reading and found that a German technique that was used to combat this was, it was for two reasons. One, there was not a lot of yeast suspended in the beer, and two, the Reinheitsgebot requires that they can't use anything other than yeast, barley, water, and hops. So they had to use those things to recarbonate. So what they would do is they would take what they would call green beer or Spieß beer out of a fermenting batch, straight out of the fermenter that had just started to go to high Kreuzen, and they would pitch that in with the conditioning or bottling volume of the batch that they were getting ready to condition. And what that does is it gives you a fresh pitch of yeast along with some new fermentable material so that those beers can now naturally carbonate. So I had great results with that. So it's called Kreuzening. And typically what I'll do is I'll do a 1 to 2 quart starter with a 1040 to 1045 DME. And as soon as it starts to go to high Kreuzen, I'm going to pitch that into the bottling bucket. I'm going to throw my beer into the bottling bucket, and I'm going to put that into the bottles. And that's gotten me past that process and typically gives me a good 2.3 to 2.5. So now this beer, you need to be a little bit higher.
Mm-hmm.
You want it to be 2.5 to 3. A little bit higher, a little bit drier. That carbonation is going to give you a perception of dryness and combat that malt. So if you're going to do that, you might want to add a little bit more fermentable material than just the 1045 wort in that Spice beer. And it looks like you had an article up there for about krausening.
Yeah.
And yeah, and there's also some other good resources. I think it's Brewkaiser has a good resource on krausening.
Yeah, very cool. I haven't done a lot of that, but I think it's a great technique.
So
go ahead.
I've done it. I've done it with every beer that I've aged more than 60 days, and it has given me excellent results. And somewhere out on the internet, I found a spreadsheet that somebody had written that did all the calculations for you, and I've been using that with my barley wines and my lagers ever since.
Very cool.
And it works fantastic.
Well, if you have that, I can put it in the show notes. Well, the main reason I don't krausen is because I don't bottle anymore. I mostly keg. I switched over years ago.
But with the barley wines, which it's not the topic, but with the barley wines is where I first found this problem. Just because they had set for 6 months, and it would have probably eventually carbonated, but it took longer than I wanted to. So it works really well for anything that's been aged and doesn't have a lot of yeast left. So I will send you that link to the spreadsheet.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I don't know if you talked about, I think you mentioned at the very beginning of the show, you do carbonate a little bit higher for this particular beer style, right?
I'm sorry?
You do carbonate a little bit higher level for this particular beer style, right? It's pretty bubbly.
It's going to be 2.5 to 3 volumes. So it's going to be on the upper end of what a standard 12-ounce bottle can take. If you're just going into a standard 12-ounce bottle, 2.5 volumes is probably where you want to go. I don't know what the limitations of those are, but 2.5 to 3 is where you want to be. It says medium to medium high carbonation. So I'm thinking that's in the three range.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, is there anything else you want to add on the specifics of Schwarzbier or brewing a Schwarzbier?
No. I would say if you're going to do it, do your research, understand what it is that you're trying to brew. Stan Hieronymus, his Appalachian website talks about beers from a place, and I think in my research I've always tried to consider that there's more to the beer than the style itself. There's the people that brewed it, there's the place that it was brewed, and then there's all that history that surrounds it, and I always just find that adds a level of involvement for me that goes beyond just brewing the beer. But just know what you're trying to brew. Try and get out there and find one of these commercial versions, this Kloster or the Kostritzer. See if you can find those. Have a couple bottles. See what it tastes like. What does it look like? Pour it in a glass. Take a look at it before you formulate your recipe, so that you know what you're expecting. And then just take a note before you brew that beer of this is what I'm going for. This is what I'm expecting to make. This is what it's going to taste like. And then when you're done and it's fermented, go back and take a look at that beer and see if it turned out like you expected. And if it didn't, but you love it, well, brew it again. And if it didn't, then figure out what you need to change. And as long as you keep good notes, you can do that.
Yeah, I found a lot of the best homebrewers are often beer judges, because they're able to judge the beer and make it better every time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thanks. Thanks for talking about that. I wanted to give you a few minutes to talk about your new experience with your new homebrew club that you're the president of.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Rivertown Homebrewers was founded just in May of last year, 2013. We started the club because my wife and I were actually moving out of the neighborhood, and two of the neighbors on an 11-house cul-de-sac and I brewed together, usually just about every weekend. And so with me moving, we wanted to make sure that we would keep in touch and that we would keep doing what we loved together, and that we would have a vehicle to do that. Well, we talked about it, and we decided that, we wanted it to be bigger than that, and we wanted it to be more than just the three of us or the 5 people that were together or the 6 or 7 neighbors that got together when we brewed, and that we wanted to really make a go at trying to have an impact on the home brewing society in Granville. There's a couple of clubs in Grand Rapids, but there really weren't any in the west side of Grand Rapids where we're located. And so we've kind of made our charter one of education and enrichment and being good stewards of the hobby. And so we really focus on trying to make sure that we're covering topics, both technical and beginners. At all of our meetings, we do classes and training. So far, I think we've done an extract class. We've done an all grain class. We did a decoction mashing class, which was fun. And we've done a class on water chemistry and treatment.
Well, you got to share the pain when you do a decoction, right?
Yeah, you do. And, you need people to be there with you while you're doing it so that they know they don't have to do it themselves, right? It's
Absolutely.
Really, the beer comes out great, but it's a process. And we've got a couple members looking at doing some other educational opportunities like mead and wines, and we're just having a lot of fun with it. We've grown from about 5 members to about 25 in 7 months, and we're looking to grow some more. And we will be pouring at Club Night at NHC this year.
Well, that brings up the second subject I wanted to mention, which, of course, is the National Homebrewers Conference in June is going to be in your hometown. I was wondering if you could talk for a moment about that.
We couldn't be more excited. Our club's really been pulling out all the stops. All of our meetings, we're talking about who can brew for the club night. We're talking about what we can, how many beers are we going to enter. We're talking about having inter-club competitions to make sure that we're pre-selecting some of the beers that we're going to enter. What are we going to do at club night? What's our costume going to be? What's our booth going to look like? Just really, really focused, laser focused on this and looking forward to it a lot. I don't know how many members we've got that are going to be attending the full show, but I will be there for the whole conference, and our vice president will be. So I look forward to meeting you there.
I'll definitely be there. We're going to have our BeerSmith booth again, and in fact, I think I'm going to try and record at least a couple podcasts, and maybe even do some rolling videos so I can capture a little bit of the event. So I think it'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'm definitely looking forward to it. It's one of my favorite times of the year to go. So
yeah,
again,
me too. And I'm sorry?
So I just want to get the dates up here. So that's June 12th to the 14th, and it's in Grand Rapids, Michigan this year. And as we're recording this, the registration's open. I'm not sure. It may just barely be open as this thing actually goes to press, but I'm not quite sure. But for those of you lucky enough to get a ticket, it's going to be quite an event.
Yeah, it will be. It will be. And there are so many great brew pubs in Grand Rapids. I know that Founders, which is right downtown Grand Rapids, is one of the main sponsors for this, and Bell's in Kalamazoo, Michigan, which is just about 45 minutes away, is one of the big sponsors for this too. So but just in downtown Grand Rapids alone, we've probably got 12 to 13 brew pubs that you can get to within a 10-mile radius. It's amazing. It's a great place to live.
Yeah, I had one of the top brewers from Bell's actually on a couple episodes ago, and he gave us some great tips on brewing as well. So.
Yeah, I think I heard that.
Yeah, it was wonderful. And finally, I just give you one chance. I think you wanted to plug a particular homebrew shop.
Yeah,
I'll give you a minute to do that.
Sure. One person, one place that has been a huge impact on my home brewing career, my home brewing hobby, is Siciliano's Market, which is located on Lake Michigan Drive in Grand Rapids. The owner and founder of that store, Steve Siciliano, he's been in the retail business here in Grand Rapids. I think he said since 1988, and in 1999, he decided that he was gonna put some shelf space up for home brewing supplies. When he told me about it, he said, I was scared to death. I was taking some of my shelf space that I could have been selling products on, and I was, taking a risk. Well, that risk really paid dividends for him, because they now have over 2,000 square feet of floor space dedicated to home brewing equipment and ingredients.
2,000 square feet just for home brewing. That's pretty amazing.
2,000 square feet. And it's a great place. They got very knowledgeable people. He and his wife and his staff are very present in the community, homebrewing community, and just the community at large. Very, very helpful. And they really anybody who lives in Grand Rapids, if you are not a home brewer yet and you're thinking about it, you have no idea how lucky you are to have this store available to you. There's been times where I wanted to buy a piece of equipment, and Steve has told me, "Don't bother buying the equipment. You'll only use it once. Take mine." Now, I don't know where you get service like that.
Well, that's fantastic.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Well, Jason, I just want to ask you real quick, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so. I just wanted to say, I really do appreciate the opportunity to be on the show and to take the time to talk about this style. Anytime that I think the best student is somebody who has to teach, and so I think I really learned a lot more about the style by taking the time to break it down to the level where I could talk about it intelligently so that others could get an idea of where it comes from. So I really thank you for that.
Well, Jason, thank you again for being on the show.
Great. No problem, Brad. Anytime.
Appreciate him being here. Again, that was Jason Jaworowicz. He is president of the Granville, Michigan-based homebrew club, Rivertown Homebrewers at rivertownhomebrewers.com. Jason's also a process engineer in Portage, Michigan, and he's been brewing since 2009. Well, a big thank you to Jason Jaworowicz for appearing on the show. Really appreciate him being here talking about Schwarzbier. A reminder for you, if you haven't already, you can sign up for the newsletter. Go to the right side on our website. There's a little box there where you can put your name and your email, and we'll send you an article on homebrewing every single week. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.